7 silent rules manipulators secretly fear. Every manipulator has one secret fear. It isn't being exposed. It isn't being embarrassed. It isn't losing an argument. Their greatest fear is meeting someone they cannot control. Someone who doesn't overreact. Someone who doesn't defend every accusation. Someone who doesn't panic when ignored. Someone who refuses to explain every decision. Because the moment you become emotionally unpredictable, a manipulator loses the only weapon they have ever truly mastered: your reactions. Most people believe the answer is confrontation. They think they should expose the manipulator, argue, fight back, prove them wrong. But have you ever noticed something? Manipulators almost never lose arguments. Not because they're right, because they're playing a completely different game. While you're trying to discover the truth, they're studying your emotions. While you're defending your reputation, they're measuring your insecurities. While you're explaining yourself, they're collecting information. The silent strategist understands something most people never learn. Manipulation doesn't begin with words. It begins with observation. The manipulator studies you long before making the first move. They notice what makes you angry, what makes you guilty, what makes you lonely, what makes you desperate for approval. And once they find that emotional button, they press it again and again and again until your reactions become completely predictable. That is why the strongest defense is never giving them a predictable emotional pattern. Imagine an experienced chess grandmaster sitting across from a beginner. The beginner believes the game starts with the first move. The grandmaster knows the game started long before that. He watches posture, confidence, patience, impulsiveness. Every tiny decision reveals information. Manipulators think exactly the same way. Before they lie, they observe. Before they criticize, they test. Before they control, they measure your boundaries. Every conversation becomes an experiment. Every disagreement becomes data. Every apology becomes intelligence they can use later. The silent strategist never forgets this. When someone is constantly trying to understand your emotional weaknesses, be careful how much of yourself you reveal. Years ago, I believed honesty meant telling people everything. How I felt, what I feared, what worried me. I thought transparency automatically created trust. Life taught me something different. Healthy people appreciate honesty. Manipulative people weaponize it. The more emotional information I gave away, the easier I became to control. That lesson became one of the earliest foundations behind the Dark Mind Protocol. Because psychological strength isn't becoming secretive. It's learning the difference between openness and exposure. Inside the Dark Mind Protocol, you'll learn how to recognize manipulation before it escalates, protect your emotional leverage, and develop the mindset of the silent strategist. A man who cannot be emotionally cornered because he understands the psychology behind every interaction. If you've ever wondered why some people always seem impossible to manipulate, you'll find a complete framework waiting for you in the first pinned comment. Today, I'm going to share the 7 silent rules that quietly dismantle manipulation. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through psychology. Because once you understand these principles, you'll stop trying to defeat manipulators. You'll become someone they quietly avoid. Rule 1: never react immediately. The greatest advantage a manipulator has is your first emotional reaction. That first flash of anger. The immediate need to defend yourself. The urge to prove them wrong. That's the moment they wait for. Imagine dropping a stone into a perfectly calm lake. The first ripple is always the strongest. Manipulators create emotional stones on purpose. A sarcastic comment, a passive-aggressive joke, a mysterious silence, a false accusation. They're not testing your intelligence. They're testing your emotional reflexes. The silent strategist never gives anyone access to his first reaction. He lets silence absorb the impact, because emotions calm faster than consequences. When someone tries to provoke him, he becomes slower, not colder, slower. That single habit changes everything. Because people who cannot predict your reactions cannot easily manipulate your behavior. One of the first things a manipulator wants is information, not because they care, because information is leverage. Imagine an experienced hunter walking through a forest. He doesn't chase blindly. He watches, tracks, footprints, broken branches. Every small clue reduces uncertainty. Manipulators hunt exactly the same way. Every unnecessary explanation, every emotional confession, every defensive speech leaves footprints. The more you explain, the easier you become to predict. Have you ever noticed how manipulative people keep asking questions that seem innocent? Why did you do that? What were you thinking? Don't you trust me? Why are you acting differently? Sometimes those questions are genuine. Sometimes they're intelligence gathering. The silent strategist answers the question being asked. Nothing more. He doesn't volunteer emotional reports. He doesn't fill silence because silence feels uncomfortable. He understands something most people never realize. Silence protects information. Information protects freedom. Years ago, a military commander was asked why his battle plans were known only by a handful of officers. He answered with one sentence: "Secrets cannot be stolen if they are never shared." That sentence has nothing to do with war. It has everything to do with life. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your thoughts. Not everyone deserves your future plans. Not everyone deserves your fears. The strongest men are not mysterious because they play games. They're selective because experience taught them. Access must be earned. Manipulators often mistake silence for weakness until they discover something unexpected. Silence gives them nothing to work with. No emotional leverage. No predictable script. No obvious insecurity. That uncertainty frustrates them because manipulation depends on information. Without information, their strategy begins collapsing. Rule 3: protect your boundaries without announcing them. Most people misunderstand boundaries. They think boundaries are speeches, long explanations, ultimatums, warnings. But real boundaries rarely require announcements. Imagine a castle surrounded by massive stone walls. The walls never argue. They never negotiate. They never explain why they're standing there. They simply exist. Strong, silent, unmovable. That is exactly how healthy boundaries work. Manipulators love verbal boundaries because verbal boundaries can be debated, negotiated, mocked, ignored, but enforced boundaries in the conversation. Suppose someone repeatedly disrespects your time. Many people say, "Please don't do that again." The manipulator nods, then repeats the behavior. The silent strategist doesn't repeat the speech. He changes access. Less availability, less attention, less opportunity. Behavior becomes the consequence, not another argument. One of the greatest misunderstandings in modern psychology is believing people respect what you say. No, people respect what consistently happens after you say it. Words create expectations. Actions create reality. Manipulators study consistency. If your consequences disappear, your boundaries disappear with them. That is why emotional discipline is more powerful than emotional intensity. When I was younger, I believed giving endless second chances made me compassionate. Eventually, I discovered something painful. Some people don't interpret endless chances as kindness. They interpret them as permission. That realization changed the way I looked at every relationship. The silent strategist never punishes. He simply adjusts access. Respect increases naturally, not because people fear him, because they understand his standards. Before we continue, think about the last person who repeatedly crossed one of your boundaries. Did they ignore your words? Or did they learn that nothing happened afterward? That question can completely change how you see relationships. One of the central ideas inside the Dark Mind Protocol is that powerful men don't control other people's behavior. They control access to themselves. Inside the program, I teach practical psychological frameworks for building boundaries that don't rely on arguments, guilt, or emotional exhaustion. They're designed to protect your peace while reinforcing the mindset of the silent strategist. If that sounds like the man you're trying to become, you'll find the complete framework waiting for you in the first pinned comment. Rule 4: never reward manipulative behavior. Behavior grows where attention goes. This is one of the oldest psychological principles ever discovered. Yet most people accidentally reward the very behavior they hate. Imagine a child throwing a tantrum inside a supermarket. The parent says no. The child screams louder. People stare. The parent finally gives in. The child doesn't learn obedience. The child learns strategy. If I create enough pressure, I get what I want. Manipulation follows the exact same principle. Adults simply become more sophisticated. Instead of screaming, they withdraw affection. Instead of crying, they create guilt. Instead of throwing objects, they create emotional confusion. Different methods, same psychology. Manipulators are constantly watching one thing. What behavior gets results? If guilt works, they'll use guilt again. If silent treatment works, they'll repeat it. If emotional outbursts force you to surrender, those outbursts become permanent. The silent strategist refuses to reward manipulation. Not with attention, not with panic, not with endless explanations. Because every emotional reward strengthens the pattern. Picture a fire. Every reaction is another piece of wood. Every desperate explanation, another log. Every emotional argument, more fuel. Then people wonder why the fire keeps growing. The silent strategist chooses differently. He removes the fuel. Without fuel, even the largest fire eventually dies. Manipulation survives on emotional energy. Starve it, and it begins losing power. One lesson remains, and it may be the most important of them all, because every manipulator eventually reaches a moment where none of their usual tactics work anymore. The reason isn't luck. It isn't confidence. It isn't intelligence. It's because they've encountered something they cannot influence. A man who has already made peace with losing people who refuse to respect him. And that is where true psychological freedom begins. Rule 5: become emotionally expensive to manipulate. Every manipulator performs the same calculation. Sometimes consciously, most of the time unconsciously. Is this person worth manipulating? If the answer is yes, they continue. If the answer becomes no, they quietly move on. Think about a professional thief walking through a parking lot. He doesn't steal every car. He looks for the easiest target, the unlocked door, the visible valuables, the distracted owner. Manipulators think exactly the same way. They don't search for the strongest person. They search for the easiest emotional access. The man who constantly explains. The woman who fears disappointing everyone. The friend who cannot tolerate conflict. The employee desperate for approval. These are not weak people. They are simply emotionally available in ways manipulators know how to exploit. The silent strategist understands something profound. Your goal is not to defeat every manipulator. Your goal is to become too expensive to manipulate. Imagine two houses. One has broken locks, open windows, no alarm, lights off. The other has reinforced doors, security cameras, motion sensors, strong lighting. Which house attracts unwanted visitors? Exactly. Not because criminals are brave, because they calculate effort. Manipulators calculate effort too. The moment they realize every attempt costs them more energy than it's worth, they stop investing in you. Not because they've changed, because you've changed. People often ask, how do I stop attracting toxic people? It's the wrong question. Toxic people approach almost everyone. The real question is, why do they leave some people so quickly? Because they recognize emotional resistance, calm, consistency, strong boundaries, predictability in principles, unpredictability in emotional reactions. The silent strategist doesn't become invisible. He becomes inconvenient. And manipulation rarely survives inconvenience. Before Rule 6, I want you to think about something. Who always seems emotionally exhausted after every interaction? The person doing the manipulating, or the person constantly trying to defend themselves? For years, I believed strength meant winning every argument. Now I understand something entirely different. The strongest position is the one where no argument is necessary. That realization became another cornerstone of the Dark Mind Protocol. Because true psychological power isn't about dominating conversations. It's about becoming so emotionally grounded that manipulation has nowhere to attach itself. Inside the Dark Mind Protocol, I teach how to build that foundation, from emotional discipline to strategic communication, so your confidence no longer depends on other people's approval. If you've ever walked away from a conversation feeling drained, guilty, or confused, the complete system is waiting for you in the first pinned comment, not to help you control others, but to ensure no one quietly controls you again. Rule 6: Let time expose people. One of the greatest mistakes people make is believing they must immediately discover who they can trust. The silent strategist never rushes that decision, because time is the greatest lie detector ever created. Imagine pouring muddy water into a glass jar. If you shake it constantly, the water never becomes clear. But if you simply leave it alone, something remarkable happens. The dirt slowly falls to the bottom. The water reveals itself. People work exactly the same way. When you constantly chase answers, you interrupt the process. When you become patient, patterns appear naturally. Manipulators cannot hide forever. Sooner or later, their actions begin, contradicting their words. Promises become excuses. Kindness becomes control. Generosity becomes expectation. Charm becomes entitlement. The silent strategist doesn't force masks to fall. He simply waits long enough for people to remove them themselves. One of the oldest sayings in history teaches, "Give a man enough rope." Most people think it means revenge. It doesn't. It means patience. Manipulators eventually reveal themselves because maintaining a false identity requires enormous effort. Nobody can perform forever. The person pretending to respect your boundaries eventually tests them. The person pretending to admire your success eventually resents it. The person pretending to support your growth eventually becomes uncomfortable when you actually grow. Time exposes what confrontation often cannot. Years ago, I learned a lesson from an old businessman. He never hired anyone quickly. Someone asked why. He answered, "Character doesn't appear during interviews. It appears during ordinary Tuesdays." I never forgot those words, because manipulation rarely announces itself dramatically. It appears in the ordinary moments, the small lies, the subtle guilt, the repeated disrespect, the tiny tests. Ignore those, and one day you'll wonder how you ended up trapped. Observe them, and you'll leave long before the trap closes. The silent strategist never falls in love with potential. He pays attention to patterns, because patterns predict the future far better than promises ever will. Only one rule remains, and it is the rule that ties everything together. It is the reason manipulators eventually stop trying. It is the difference between reacting to life and quietly mastering it. Rule 7: Become impossible to control. Every rule we've discussed today leads to this one, because manipulation was never really about lies, or guilt, or intimidation. Those are only tools. The real objective has always been the same: control. Control over your emotions. Control over your decisions. Control over your attention. Control over your future. The silent strategist understands something that changes every relationship. No one can truly control a man who has already decided what he stands for. Imagine a compass. Storms come. The wind changes direction. The ocean becomes violent. Ships lose sight of the stars. But the compass continues, pointing north. Not because the storm disappears, because its direction does not depend on the storm. Character works exactly the same way. People will criticize you, praise you, ignore you, admire you, manipulate you, misunderstand you. None of those things should decide your direction. Your principles should. That is why powerful men appear so calm. Not because life is easier for them, because their identity is anchored somewhere deeper than other people's opinions. One of the greatest victories a manipulator can achieve is making you doubt yourself, making you apologize for boundaries, question your memory, feel guilty for protecting your peace, explain decisions that required no explanation. The moment you begin defending your identity, you've already stepped onto their battlefield. The silent strategist refuses that invitation. He knows something most people discover far too late. Not every accusation deserves an answer. Not every misunderstanding deserves clarification. Not every opinion deserves your attention. Sometimes, silence is not avoidance. It is discernment. Years ago, an old sword master was asked why he had never lost a duel. People expected him to describe some secret technique. Instead, he smiled and said, "Because I refuse most invitations." The students looked confused. The master continued, "The easiest duel to win is the one you never agree to fight." That lesson reaches far beyond combat. How many emotional duels have you accepted this year? Arguments that solved nothing. Conversations designed only to provoke you. People demanding explanations they had no intention of respecting. Hours of emotional energy given to people who had already decided not to understand you. The silent strategist protects something more valuable than pride. He protects attention, because attention is life. Where your attention goes, your future follows. Imagine walking through an enormous marketplace. Hundreds of merchants shout your name. Each one insists their product is the most important. If you stopped at every stall, you would never reach your destination. Manipulators work the same way. Every emotional distraction, every unnecessary conflict, every attempt to pull you into chaos steals attention from your purpose. The strongest men are not those who answer every challenge. They are the ones who recognize which battles deserve absolutely nothing. That is not weakness. That is strategy. Looking back, I realize I wasted years trying to convince the wrong people. Try to explain myself. Try to prove my intentions. Try to earn respect from people who benefited whenever I questioned my own value. Eventually, I understood something that changed everything. Peace is not found when everyone understands you. Peace begins when you stop needing everyone to. That realization became the heart of the Dark Mind Protocol. Because becoming impossible to manipulate isn't about learning tricks. It is about building a mind that cannot be bought with approval, controlled by guilt, or redirected by fear. Inside the Dark Mind Protocol, you'll discover the complete system behind emotional discipline, psychological resilience, powerful boundaries, strategic communication, and the philosophy of the Silent Strategist. If today's episode helped you recognize patterns you've experienced for years, don't let it remain just another interesting video. Build the habits that make manipulation impossible. You'll find a complete framework waiting for you in the first pinned comment. The decision, as always, is yours. Most manipulators never change. They simply look for easier targets. Make sure you never become one of them. Remember the 7 silent rules. Don't react immediately. Don't explain more than necessary. Protect your boundaries through actions. Never reward manipulation. Become emotionally expensive to manipulate. Let time expose people. Build a character that cannot be controlled. Practice these long enough, and something remarkable happens. Manipulators stop seeing opportunity when they look at you. They see resistance, calm, discipline, standards. A man who cannot be emotionally purchased. A man who no longer fears disappointing those who profit from his weakness. That is why the goal was never to become feared. It was never to become cold. It was never to manipulate better than manipulators. The goal was always freedom, because the day you stop needing their approval is the day they lose their power over you. And that is the day the Silent Strategist is finally born. I'll see you in the next episode of Dark Mind Protocol.